The first thing Eleanor Pike said to me was, "Not good morning, not sorry to bother you, not even nice cattle." She stepped out of that pearl-white Range Rover like she owned the sunrise and told me my well was now a community asset. She had 2 county officers behind her, one man from code enforcement holding a clipboard, and a folded cease and desist order in her hand like it was a royal decree. And I remember standing there in my boots, smelling diesel from the drilling rig and wet red dirt from the pasture, thinking, Lord, this woman really drove 7 miles down a gravel road to steal water from thirsty cows. My name is Wyatt Harlan, and my family has been running cattle outside Briar Creek, Oklahoma, since before there was a paved road to town. My great-grandfather bought this land with money he made, shoeing horses and hauling fence posts. My grandfather survived 2 dust storms and 1 bank foreclosure. My dad held on to it through a divorce that almost split the whole place in half. And me, well, I thought the hardest thing I would ever fight was drought, feed prices, and a bull named Samson who hated every gate I ever built. I was wrong. The hardest thing I ever fought wore cream-colored slacks, carried a leather binder, and smiled like a person who had never been told no in a language she understood. Eleanor Pike was the president of Falcon Crest Reserve, the luxury subdivision that had crawled up against my north fence over the last few years, all stone mailboxes, sprayed lawns, and houses with kitchens bigger than my first barn. Folks there had money, and I never held that against them. Money does not make a person bad, but money mixed with boredom and a little authority, that can turn regular people into border guards of the kingdom of nonsense. Eleanor had made Falcon Crest her private courtroom. She fined people for leaving trash cans out 6 inches too far, sent warning letters over porch swing colors, and once, according to my neighbor Lyle, tried to ban a little girl from selling lemonade because the stand did not match the approved exterior palette. So when she came after well, I should have laughed, but I did not, because behind her pretty smile was something colder than pettiness. She pointed at the brand new wellhead near my lower pasture, the one I had paid $14,000 to drill after 6 months of permits, soil reports, and state water forms, and she said, Wyatt, this structure violates the Falcon Crest Community Preservation Covenant, Section 12, Paragraph C. Resource extraction requires board approval. I wiped my hands on my jeans and said, Eleanor, this is not a subdivision amenity. It is a livestock well on agricultural land. She tilted her head like I had just mispronounced my own name. Agricultural or not, your parcel was absorbed into the Falcon Crest Overlay District last year, which means the board has jurisdiction. And because water access impacts community stability, the board is prepared to assume supervisory control of this source until further review. Supervisory control. That was her way of saying she wanted the water without having to admit she was taking it. I asked her what exactly she expected me to do with 80 head of cattle during a drought, and she gave me a look I have never forgotten. Not angry, not confused, just inconveniently patient, like I was a slow cashier at a store where she deserved better service. Maybe reduce your herd, she said. Rural habits have to adapt when communities grow. Now, I am not a hothead by nature, mostly because cattle would teach you that panic solves exactly nothing. But I felt heat come up the back of my neck so fast I could hear my pulse in my ears. Those rural habits she was talking about were my mortgage, my father's grave, my mother's peach trees, the fence line my grandfather built with hands so busted he could not button his own shirt by 60. But I also knew something Eleanor did not. I had been waiting for someone like her 4 years earlier. Briar Creek held a planning meeting about expanding residential development west of Highway 16, and I sat in the back eating stale cookies, listening to men in pressed shirts talk about underutilized agricultural parcels like they were discussing empty shelves at a grocery store. That night, something in my gut started knocking, so I did what Harmon men do when we get worried. I got quiet, got stubborn, and started reading. I read county land records until my eyes burned. Read old water statutes, agricultural exemptions, riparian rights, annexation procedures, covenant limits, case law from 3 states I do not even like driving through. And every time I found something boring enough to put a normal person to sleep, I printed it and stuck it in a blue folder labeled in black marker, just in case. My wife Annie used to tease me about it. She would come into the kitchen at midnight, find me surrounded by paper and say, Wyatt, are you defending the ranch or studying to become the most tired lawyer in Oklahoma? I would tell her, maybe both. Then the drought came, and nobody was laughing much anymore. The creek behind the hay barn turned into a chain of mud puddles. The pond dropped so low the turtles looked embarrassed, and my cattle started gathering by the fence at dawn, bawling in that dry, hollow way that gets under your ribs. Meanwhile, Falcon Crest kept its entrance fountains running, sprinklers ticking across lawns at sunrise like tiny applause for bad priorities. That was when I opened an old cedar box my mother kept in the hall closet, and under a stack of ration books, war letters, and my grandmother's church gloves, I found the paper that changed everything. It was a 1916 deed reservation, signed by my great-grandfather and filed at the county courthouse, preserving perpetual subsurface spring and aquifer access for Harlan heirs and agricultural use, attached to the land, not the owner, not the house, not the fashion of the county commission at any given moment. Caleb Ruiz, my old friend and the only lawyer I knew who could drink gas station coffee like it was medicine, looked at it for 10 minutes and leaned back in his chair. "Wyatt," he said, "this thing is older than half the laws they are going to throw at you. File the permit, drill the well, and not lose this original unless your barn catches fire, and even then grab it before the horses." So I did everything right. I paid the fees. I waited through inspections. I hired a licensed drilling crew. I logged water samples before the pump even went live. By the time Eleanor Pike showed up with her cease and desist order, that well was more documented than most marriages. Still, she stood there with her binder and told me I had 48 hours to cap it or Falcon Crest would start issuing $750 daily fines, plus legal fees, plus administrative penalties, plus possible liens for non-compliance. She said all that calmly, like she was reading the weather. Then she leaned closer, perfume fighting with diesel fumes in the morning air, and said, "Wyatt, I have already helped 3 problem properties transition out of agricultural use. Yours does not need to be unpleasant." That was the moment the whole thing changed for me. Before that, I thought she was an overreaching HOA president with too much time and a grudge against cow smell. But when she said 3 problem properties, I saw the pattern. The Bellamy orchard sold after 2 years of violations. Old Mr. Keene moved after his equipment shed got cited every month. The Whitlock family leased out their pasture because they could not afford the assessments. Eleanor was not enforcing rules. She was clearing land. I took the papers from her hand, glanced at the order, and said, "Eleanor, you might want to have your attorney read the agricultural exemption clauses before you start making threats." She smiled, and it was almost kind if you did not know better. "Wyatt," she said, "men like you always think history is a shield, that paperwork does not stop progress." Then she turned, climbed back into that spotless Range Rover, and left a cloud of dust hanging over my pasture like a warning. 2 days later, Caleb came flying up my driveway in his old pickup, tires spitting gravel, face pale under his ball cap, and I knew before he opened the door that Eleanor had fired the next shot. "Emergency injunction," he said, waving a stack of papers. "Hearing tomorrow morning. She is claiming your well is an illegal commercial extraction site threatening subdivision aquifer." I looked down at the complaint, at the photographs of my wellhead taken from beyond my fence, at the words environmental danger and community harm dressed up like truth, and for 1 second, I felt the kind of fear a man does not like admitting to. Not fear of losing a lawsuit, not exactly, but fear of watching a stranger with better shoes rewrite your life in a language expensive enough to sound official. Caleb tapped the page with 1 finger. "Bad news is, Judge Marlowe is hearing it. He owns 2 rentals in Falcon Crest." I let out a laugh, not because it was funny, but because sometimes the universe gets so crooked you have to admire the craftsmanship. Then I walked into the house, pulled the blue folder from the cabinet, set my great-grandfather's deed on the kitchen table, and told Caleb, "All right then, let's make her regret putting this in writing." The courthouse in Briar Creek smelled like old paper, burnt coffee, and everybody pretending not to be nervous. Eleanor Pike sat at the front table in a charcoal blazer with a gold pin shaped like a falcon on her collar, which felt a little dramatic for a woman trying to shut down a cow. Well, but I will give her this. She knew how to dress for intimidation. Beside her was a lawyer named Preston Vale, a silver-haired man with soft hands and the kind of voice that made simple lies sound like they had been notarized. Caleb and I sat on the other side with 1 cardboard box, 3 folders, and the original 1916 water deed wrapped in a plastic sleeve Annie normally used for her recipe cards. Judge Marlowe came in already looking annoyed, like the truth had interrupted his tea time. Preston stood first and painted me as some reckless back pasture tycoon, draining the earth for profit. He called my livestock, well, an unregulated extraction facility. Said Falcon Crest families were terrified for their children, their home values, their groundwater, their future. Eleanor nodded along with her lips pressed together. Not sad exactly, more like a person watching a waiter finally remove the wrong dish. When Preston slid enlarged photos of my wellhead across the table, I almost laughed. They had shot that little pump from low angles like it was a nuclear plant. Then Caleb stood up, slow and plain, because Caleb never wasted movement unless a vending machine stole his dollar. Your Honor, he said, Mr. Harlan is not operating a commercial extraction facility. He is watering cattle on agricultural land under a permitted private livestock well. Judge Marlowe sighed and said, Counsel, that is what we are here to determine. And that was my cue. I stood with my hands sweating around the folder, and for a second I saw my dad in my head, standing in that same courthouse years ago, fighting over fence easements, wearing his church shirt because he believed a man should look respectful when defending his land. I laid out the state permit first, then the drilling inspection, then the weekly water logs. Then I showed them the hydrology report I had paid for back when Annie thought I was being paranoid. The report showed my well pulled from the Red Fork Formation, a deeper pocket of water separated by clay and sandstone from the shallow aquifer Falcon Crest used for lawns and fountains. I said, Your Honor, their subdivision sprinklers and decorative ponds do not touch my source, and my source does not touch theirs. Preston objected, mostly because he did not like the sound of a farmer speaking in complete sentences, but Judge Marlowe leaned forward. Then Caleb pulled the second folder from the box. County construction records show Falcon Crest used nearly 3 million gallons during its final build-out phase, including pool filling, landscape installation, and road dust suppression. Without filing the environmental review they now claim my client needs. The courtroom got very still. Eleanor stopped nodding. I could see her jaw tighten from 20 feet away. Finally, I unwrapped the 1916 deed. That paper looked fragile enough to dissolve in a hard breath, but it hit that courtroom like a church bell. The judge read it twice. Preston whispered to Eleanor. Eleanor whispered back hard enough that I saw his ear turn red. Then Judge Marlowe cleared his throat and said the emergency injunction was denied. Just like that. All that perfume, all those photos, all that polished panic, and the answer was no. But people like Eleanor do not hear no the way regular folks hear no. To her, no was just a slower route to yes. She caught me in the hallway near the vending machines, close enough that Caleb stepped between us without thinking. Enjoy your little performance, Wyatt, she said. You got lucky with an old piece of paper. I told her, Eleanor, that old piece of paper has outlived better bullies than you. A smile flickered. You have no idea what kind of pressure a community can apply when it feels threatened. I drove home that afternoon trying to feel victorious, but the sky was the color of tin. The pastures were still dry, and Annie was standing on the porch with her arms crossed, which usually meant bad news had reached the house before I did. She handed me a letter. Falcon Crest had issued an emergency legal protection assessment, $3,100 per household, due in 30 days, to defend the community against outside agricultural risk. Outside. That word sat in my mouth like rust. They had annexed me when it suited them and called me outside when they needed a villain. By supper, my phone started ringing. First it was Lyle Donnelly from 2 roads over, asking if I really was poisoning the groundwater, but he asked it like a man who wanted me to tell him no. Then Mrs. Nora Bell called, voice trembling, saying she could not pay $3,100, not with her husband in rehab after the stroke. Then a young father named Graham from Falcon Crest pulled into my drive after dark and sat at my kitchen table with his ball cap in both hands, admitting he had voted for Eleanor because she promised order, and now he felt like the order had turned into a bill he could not afford. That was the first crack in her wall. Fear built that wall, but money started knocking bricks loose. Eleanor must have sensed it too, because 3 days later, a county health inspector named June Carver came out to the ranch with a test kit, a tired face, and an apology she was trying not to say out loud. We received multiple anonymous complaints. She told me livestock illness, chemical runoff, unusual odors near the well. I said, June, the unusual odor is probably a bull named Samson, and he has been offending noses since 2019. She almost smiled, then remembered she was on duty. I let her test whatever she wanted. Before she left, I gave her my water logs, cattle health records, and vet reports, all dated, All boring, all beautiful in the way boring paperwork becomes beautiful when somebody is trying to hang you with a rumor. 2 days later, June called me herself. "Wyatt," she said, "I do not know who is stirring this up, but your water is cleaner than half the private wells I inspect. No bacteria, no chemical contamination. Mineral balance is excellent." Then she paused and said something I was not expecting. "I am recommending you well for the County Drought Assistance Registry. You have a reliable source, and nearby agricultural operations may need emergency access if this summer gets worse." I stood in my barn with the phone against my ear, looking at that little wellhead Eleanor had called a threat, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something like peace. It lasted about 6 hours. That evening, the Briarcrete Ledger ran an online piece about environmental concerns surrounding an unauthorized ranch well near Falcon Crest. Anonymous residents were worried. Anonymous parents were frightened. Anonymous experts had questions. I read that article twice, then sat back and laughed so hard Annie came in from the laundry room asking if I had finally cracked. Eleanor had planted complaints, triggered an inspection, leaked fear to the paper before the results came back, and planned to ride the confusion like a parade horse. But she forgot one thing. Inspectors have phones too. June Carver called the editor the next morning, and by lunch the paper had updated the story with the county results showing no environmental concern. The correction was dry as toast, but to me, it read like poetry. Eleanor responded by calling a special community meeting. She packed the Falcon Crest clubhouse with nervous hamminess, a few bored loyalists, and enough fake concern to power a daytime talk show. She stood under recessed lighting with slides behind her showing my wellhead, my cattle, my rusted feed trailer, all photographed like evidence from a crime scene. "Friends and neighbors," she began, "we are facing a rural industrial intrusion that threatens our investment, our safety, and the character of our community." That phrase, character of our community, always means somebody wants to exclude someone without saying the ugly part out loud. I waited until she started talking about children drinking contaminated water. Then I stood up with June Carver's official report in my hand. Eleanor tried to gavel me down, even though no one had ever given her a gavel. She just owned one, which tells you plenty. I said, "Folks deserve the full report." Then I read it out loud. No contamination, no environmental violation. Water quality exceeds state standards. The room went quiet in that thick way. Rooms go quiet when people realize they have been sold a story with missing pages. Eleanor's face did something small and ugly, like a curtain twitching in a haunted house. She said the county report was incomplete, possibly compromised, and that she would be escalating to state and federal agencies, and she did, over the next 10 days. Letters arrived from the state environmental office, from a federal water compliance desk, from the county attorney, all polite, all official, all born from the same poisoned seed. But every complaint forced another review, and every review produced another clean finding. Eleanor was not building a case against me. She was building mine against her. The real break came from Graham, the young father who had sat at my kitchen table. He and Nora Bell requested Falcon Crest financial records, and what they found made Caleb whistle through his teeth. Eleanor had used association funds for private investigators, legal consultations, environmental strategy meetings, and what she called rural transition research. The Bellamy orchard was in there. Old Mr. Keene was in there. The Whitlocks were in there. Line by line, check by check, she had used neighborhood money to pressure agricultural families until they sold, leased, or gave up. Caleb spread the papers across my table and said, "Wyatt, this is not HOA overreach anymore. This is fraud with landscaping." Then my cousin Ray, who worked in the county records basement and owed me because I once pulled his truck out of a flooded ditch at 2 a.m, called and told me to come before closing. He did not explain. Ray never explained when drama would do. I found him under buzzing fluorescent lights with a rolled survey map from 1984, the year Falcon Crest was first incorporated. He tapped a faded boundary line and said, "See that? Your ranch was excluded. All agricultural parcels west of Dry Run Road were excluded." Then he slid me the 2022 Overlay Expansion Eleanor file. No owner consent forms. No 30-day notices. No agricultural review. Nothing. My hands went cold. Ray said, "Wyatt, she never had jurisdiction over you. Not last year. Not this year. Not for 1 minute." I stared at those maps while 4 years of late-night reading snapped into focus. Every fine, every threat, every public accusation, every assessment, every family she pushed around, all of it stood on a foundation that did not legally exist. Eleanor Pike had built a kingdom on a forged border. And tomorrow night, at the annual Falcon Crest meeting, I was going to bring the map. I barely slept the night before that meeting. Not because I was scared exactly, though I was some, but because there comes a point in a fight when your nerves stop feeling like fear and start feeling like electricity. Like your whole body knows Dawn is carrying something big and irreversible. Annie found me in the kitchen at 4:30 in the morning with the survey map rolled out beside the coffee pot, Caleb's notes stacked in neat piles, and the old 1916 deed lying there under the light like a witness that had finally decided to talk. She set a mug in front of me and said, "Wyatt, whatever happens tonight, do not let that woman pull you down to her level." I told her, honey, I do not think I can get my boots that high. She laughed, soft and tired, then put one hand on my shoulder, and it hit me how long she had been carrying this with me. The late nights, the legal bills, the dry fields, the way every letter in the mailbox had started to feel like a threat. Around noon, Caleb called and said Eleanor had made one last desperate swing. She filed an emergency motion claiming I intended to disrupt a private community meeting with fraudulent evidence and threatening conduct. I asked him if Judge Marlowe signed it, and Caleb said no, not even he wanted that stain on his shirt anymore. Still, by 6 o'clock, when I pulled up to the Falcon Crest clubhouse with Annie beside me and a cardboard tube holding the map across the back seat, Eleanor had private security at the door. Two broad-shouldered men in black polos looking like they had trained all their lives for the sacred duty of protecting a room full of folding chairs. The parking lot was packed. More packed than I expected. Not just Falcon Crest residents either. I saw Lyle there, Graham, Nora Bell, the Keen's son, the Bellamys, even a couple of county folks pretending they were only curious. That is the funny thing about power. When it starts cracking, people show up to hear the sound. Inside, the air smelled like lemon cleaner, nervous sweat, and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. Eleanor stood at the front in a navy dress with those pearl earrings she wore whenever she wanted to look like decency in human form. She had a podium, a projector, and a smile that looked glued on at the edges. Wyatt Harlem is not a member in good standing, she announced the second she saw me, and access to this meeting is limited to authorized residents and board personnel. Before he could answer, Graham stood up from the third row and said, "Actually, if you are going to keep charging us to fight him, I think we all deserve to hear him." That opened the gate. Nora stood next, then another couple, then three more voices from the back. It was not a roar, not yet, but it was enough. The security men glanced at each other, then at the room, and for the first time all night, Eleanor looked unsure which script she was in. "Fine," she said, lips tight. "Let the record reflect that Mr. Harlan is here over board objection." Then she launched into her speech, and I will give it to her. She had polished it well. She talked about preserving community integrity, protecting property values, environmental uncertainty, public trust, and that old favorite, neighborhood character. She clicked through slides of my cattle, my feed trailer, my fence line, turning ordinary country life into something that looked menacing under fluorescent light. Then she made a mistake. She said, "For the past 18 months, I have worked tirelessly to remove destabilizing agricultural encroachment from this district. Remove, not regulate, not mediate. Remove." You could feel the room react to that word. I stood up before she could keep digging and said, "Eleanor, before you remove anything else, maybe you should tell these people you never had the authority to touch my land in the first place." She tried to bang the useless little gavel again. "Sit down, Wyatt." I did not. Caleb walked to the front, plugged in our projector, and cast the 1984 incorporation map onto the wall behind her. It glowed there, bigger than life. Those boundary lines in faded county ink. And even from the back of the room, people could see the bold exclusion mark west of Dry Run Road. Caleb said, "This is the original Falcon Crest Incorporation survey, filed with the county. It explicitly excludes all agricultural parcels west of Dry Run Road, including the Harlan Ranch." Then he threw up the 2022 overlay filing Eleanor had pushed through. No owner consent, no statutory notice, no agricultural review, no lawful annexation. I heard somebody whisper, "Oh my God." Somebody else said, "She lied to us." Eleanor stepped away from the podium, face shining now, and said those documents are incomplete. That overlay was recognized administratively. Then Ray rose from the sidewall where I had not even noticed him standing. county badge clipped to his belt, and said, "No, ma'am, it was submitted administratively. That is not the same thing as recognized legally. You never completed the statutory requirements." A murmur rolled across the room like wind through dry grass. Then Caleb laid out the financial records. Checks to investigators, fees to consultants, strategy calls, legal retainers, rural transition research, which is a fancy phrase for trying to shove farmers off land without saying it plain. He read the totals out loud, and every number landed harder than the one before. By then, Graham was on his feet, asking about the special assessment. Nora wanted to know where the money went. Old Mr. Bellamy's son asked whether his parents were forced out under false authority. Eleanor did what people like Eleanor always do when the walls close in. She got louder. She said she had acted for the good of the community, that some people were too naive to understand long-term planning, that if she had been harsh, it was only because nobody else had the courage to protect Falcon Crest from decline. To climb. There it was, the real thing underneath all the polished language. She was not defending a neighborhood. She was cleansing a picture. Just then the back doors opened, and in walked two investigators from the Oklahoma Attorney General's office and June Carver from County Health, all three carrying folders. I had known they might come. Caleb had made calls after we found the records, but seeing them step in right on that cue felt almost unfair, like heaven had decided to get theatrical. One of the investigators, a woman named Dana Mercer, came straight to the front and said, "Miss Pike, we have reviewed preliminary evidence of fraudulent misrepresentation of jurisdiction, misuse of homeowners association funds, and retaliatory filing of knowingly false environmental complaints." Eleanor actually laughed. One short, sharp laugh, the kind people make when reality has started sounding insulting. "You cannot be serious," Dana said. "I am very serious, and if I were you, I would stop talking now." But Eleanor had been talking her way over people for too many years to discover silence in one night. She pointed at me and said, "This man manipulated all of you. He turned one irrigation dispute into a circus because he cannot accept that the future of this county is residential growth, not livestock and rust." I looked at her then, really looked, and I think that was the first time I stopped being angry enough to see her clearly. Eleanor was not fighting me because of a well. She was fighting the idea that something old and stubborn and rural could remain standing where she had already pictured a cleaner, richer, more controllable world. I said, "No, Eleanor, this was never about the future. It was about you deciding who gets to belong in it." The room went dead quiet. Dana stepped beside her and said, "Miss Pike, you are being formally notified that a state investigation is now open, and you are to surrender all association financial records and cease enforcement activity pending review." She did not slap cuffs on her. Real life is usually less tidy than movies, but it did not need handcuffs. The look on the faces around that room did the job. Her power left before she did. Graham asked for her resignation on the spot. Nora seconded it. Then 10 more voices followed, and just like that, the whole stage she had built for herself turned into a witness stand. Eleanor looked around for someone to save her, but there was nobody left. Not the board, not the security guys, not the homeowners she had billed into loyalty. She gathered her papers with shaking hands, and as she passed me, she said, "You think you won?" I told her, "No, Mom, I think the truth finally got a turn." 6 months later, the well is still running, the cattle are fat, and the drought assistance registry ended up helping 3 nearby ranches make it through August. Falcon Crest got a new board. The special assessment was cancelled, and a civil case forced Eleanor to repay a chunk of what she misused. The Bellamys are trying to buy back their orchard. Nora sends Annie tomatoes every summer. Graham helped me mend North Fence in the fall, and we did not talk about politics once, which in this country counts as a minor miracle. But I still think about that night more than I probably should, because the thing that stays with you is not the victory. Not really. It is how close a person with enough confidence and enough paperwork can come to rewriting somebody else's home. So now I want to ask you something. If you had been in that room, would you have trusted Eleanor at first? Would you have believed the polished version of progress? Or would you have seen the land grab hiding underneath it? And here is the harder question. When does protecting a community turn into controlling it? And who gets to decide which kind of life belongs on a piece of ground? Let me know in the comments, because I have got my own opinion, obviously, but I want to hear yours. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a zoning board, or one person in town who thought they should get to play king over everybody else. Share that story too, because sometimes the only thing stronger than bad power is a room full of people finally willing to say enough.